Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Rath Wang. The Democratic National Convention was held in Chicago for 4 consecutive days, starting August 19th. Approximately 50,000 people attended from various states across the United States. In addition to President Biden's delivering a farewell speech, Vice President Kamala Harris formally accepted the Democratic nomination with what the New York Times notes as one of the most consequential speeches in U.S. presidential politics. We discuss Kamala Harris's run against former President Donald Trump and what it means for Taiwan. Joining us today are William Stanton, former American Institute in Taiwan director, Marcin Jerzewski, European Value Center for Security Policy Taiwan office head. A very warm welcome to both on the show today. Before becoming vice president, Harris served as U.S. Senator for 4 years, mainly focusing on the judiciary and intelligence. She also previously, for decades, spent most of her career as a prosecutor in California. Her critics say she may lack diplomatic experience. Ambassador, what do you say to that?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, foreign policy experience has never been a requirement even to be Secretary of State. Sometimes it's a success. For example, President Reagan appointed George Shultz, who served for 7 years and is regarded as being an excellent Secretary of State. Rex Tillerson was appointed by Donald Trump. He served for 1 year and then no longer. I think it's, not necessarily a requirement. Moreover, Kamala Harris has been made 17 foreign trips, 21 countries in her 3.5 years as a vice president. And, she's obviously keen on foreign policy issues. So it's hard to make a judgment just based on past experience. The Chatham House did a study, and they said that you have to go back to George H.W. Bush 25 years ago to find a president who had previous foreign policy experience, extensive experience, before becoming a president.
Marcin, you are a former resident of the United States and also have done much research about U.S. foreign policy. How do you see Harris's candidacy?
I think that Kamala Harris, importantly, has the potential to break the highest glass ceiling in American politics. And it's a glass ceiling that is defined not only by gender constraints, but also racial constraints. She is already making history by being the first African-American and first Asian-American woman to be at the top of a ticket of any major party. And I think it is extremely important because this brings the possibility of having a U.S. president be a president of all Americans and to have the face of the U.S. government be more representative of the United States that is becoming increasingly diverse. And just to very briefly circle back to the previous question about her foreign policy experience or lack thereof, it is important that we don't lose sight of the fact that she is not a newcomer to Washington, D.C., and as Ambassador Stanton emphasized, she made multiple foreign trips. What is important for example, the European policy community, she made some very powerful and well-received interventions at the Munich Security Forum. Just as an example, she met with Xi Jinping during her visit to Thailand, and she took a very clear stance on multiple pieces of legislation that are important for Taiwan's quest to expand its international space by, for example, showing her support for the Taiwan Travel Act in 2018.
And she also met with then Taiwan Vice President Lai Ching-te.
Absolutely, during his transfer, yeah.
What many in Taiwan are most concerned about when it comes to U.S. elections is the country's policy towards Taiwan and China. Let's hear from Jay Chen, a California delegate who voted to officially nominate Vice President Harris at the convention. I spoke with him earlier on the floor of the DNC.
The fact that the Democratic Party would include the 6 assurances, because you have to understand that the United States has treaties, agreements, obligations with a lot of different countries. We don't list them all, but for us to actually list out our specific obligations to Taiwan's security means a lot. and it just reinforces the Democratic Party and the Biden-Harris campaign team's commitment to Taiwan. As you know, President Biden explicitly stated that if China were to attack Taiwan, that the U.S. would come to Taiwan's defense. This was unprecedented. Previously, we maintained strategic ambiguity, but President Biden went out and committed to that. And I'm so thankful that we have Vice President Harris, who is now officially our Democratic nominee, and she's going to continue that commitment to Taiwan as well. We've already seen in her acceptance speech how she's going to stand up to dictators, stand up to the autocrats, as opposed to someone like Trump, who tries to curry favor and tries to win the respect of people like Putin and Xi and Kim Jong-un.
Ambassador, we just heard from Jay that he believes Harris will be a strong supporter of Taiwan. What do you say to that in terms of policy? Will there be a change from what we have with the Biden administration?
You know, it's hard to predict what future policy will be. In my own experience, an awful lot will depend on who's appointed as aides to whoever's president. So, for example, I think one of the reasons President Trump was pretty strong against China on many issues and seemed to be very pro-Taiwanese was the very fact that he had people working for him like Mike Pompeo, Matt Pottinger, John Bolton, people who subsequently actually disagreed with Trump and his approach to things, but who I think guided early on what his policy would be toward Taiwan and China. President Trump has made the point that in the future, he's going to get people who are clearly more indebted to him, who are not going to go their own way. He wants people who are going to follow what his path is going to be. So we don't know what that is yet. I would say overall, from my perspective, I was disappointed, both by President Biden's policies, but also by President Trump's. I mean, President Biden came in and he said a lot of the right things, but then he muddled them because he'd say, yeah, we're going to defend Taiwan if it's attacked. And then he would say thereafter, well, our policy is not going to change. Well, it became a little bit more ambiguous what that meant. So I don't think either the Biden administration or the Trump administration did things I would have liked to have seen in support of Taiwan. For example, falling behind on delivery of arms. Some $19 billion in arms have never been delivered to Taiwan. Also, the issue of the 2758 resolution, UN resolution, a lot of people now are talking about that. The U.S. has never come out with a clear position in either administration to say, hey, we need to stop China from saying that this particular UN resolution means that Taiwan is part of Chinese territory. So I think there are things that both administrations could have done that they did not do.
But looking forward, do you feel there will be change in that, given that there's a new team coming in?
Well, that's what we can hope for. But again, I think what is very important is who are going to be the foreign policy aides to Harris if she's elected, or who will Donald Trump bring in if he's reelected. I think that played a very important part of the Trump administration's policy in his previous administration, and we don't know yet who will be advising Kamala Harris.
Marcin, what do you think?
It is very difficult to read the tea leaves, especially in a very tumultuous geopolitical setting that we are experiencing right now. The incoming administration, whether it's a Trump 2.0 or a Harris administration, will have to deal with a very tricky confluence of conflicts in three global hotpoints: growing tensions in the Taiwan Strait, continued Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as Israel-Gaza conflict. And resources that the U.S. has at its disposal might seem extreme in comparison and relative to other players in international politics, but at the end of the day, every resource stockpile is scarce, and any incoming administration will face some very difficult decisions regarding resource allocation. From the perspective of European policy makers and policy watchers, this election is very much about the credibility and possibility of continuity of America's global leadership.
But having said that, how concerned are they of a Trump 2.0 presidency? Or do you feel they're already making contingency plans for that?
It is a tremendous concern for most member states. And again, Europe is not a homogeneous place. So interests and priorities and policy-making modus operandi of individual member states differ. And these decisions come to light in efforts to coordinate the common foreign and security policy of the European Union. But because Europe is facing a tremendous challenge of the largest kinetic conflict on the continent since World War II, Europe needs American leadership. And I don't think that it is unreasonable for people like Donald Trump or those in his surrounding to make sure that European countries stop being free riders. There is quite a lot of diversity across the continent in the level of defense spending. For example, with Poland about to reach 5% of its GDP being dedicated to defense expenditure next year. Many countries in Western Europe lagging behind, not crossing the 2% threshold. So irrespective of the outcome of the elections, there needs to be a very serious conversation within the context of transatlantic ties about burden sharing.
Ambassador.
I would just point out that both Biden and to some extent Kamala Harris have undercut their support for Taiwan. For example, it's true that President Trump, when he was president, received a phone call from Tsai Ing-wen, but there's no evidence they ever had any further contact after that congratulatory call. It's also a fact that although his administration passed a number of pieces of legislation, he approved them, 6 pieces in particular that were supportive of Taiwan, more recent statements by Donald Trump have been very transactional, where he's indicated that, well, for example, Taiwan has stolen American technology, they owe us a debt, and been sort of very demanding of what Taiwan would do. Kamala Harris gave a statement where she said, well, Taiwan is a vibrant democracy which contributes to the global good. But then she said, sort of undercutting her view on Taiwan a little bit, we will continue to deepen not our ties, we will continue to deepen our unofficial ties, therefore, in a sense, being a bit obsequious to the Chinese point of view.
Turning to the Chinese, how do you see in terms of China wanting or preferring which candidate? Or do you feel China is also, like the rest of the world, not putting all their eggs in one basket?
They know Trump, they know what they can expect, so it's always better to deal with a known rather than an unknown. I would imagine that they might feel a little bit more secure dealing with Trump, particularly because he can be very transactional. So they could make an offer, perhaps, that he wouldn't want to refuse. But on the other hand, they might think that also in the long run, given the Democratic stance on a lot of issues, Kamala Harris is an unknown, and she might be a big proponent for human rights, which would be a problem for China. But on the other hand, she would also be averse to getting into a conflict with China. So I think it's very undetermined now.
Going back to Taiwan, Taiwan also sent a tripartisan delegation to observe the DNC. Congressman Ted Lieu, vice chair of the House Democratic Caucus, met with the delegation. I asked him about the current state of Taiwan-U.S. relations, the arms delivery backlog, and vice presidential nominee Tim Walz. Let's take a look.
The state is strong, and I just want to note that the Biden-Harris administration had requested a supplemental amount of funding for the Indo-Pacific of billions of dollars. It was the Republicans who held that up for 6 months, but eventually Congress was able to pass it, and the Biden-Harris administration got it into law. I continue to be one of the strong supporters of the Taiwan Relations Act, including the assurances, and I just want to note that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, they do not praise dictators. Donald Trump does. I'm part of the Taiwan Caucus. It's one of the largest bipartisan caucuses in the United States Congress. There's strong support for the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, and I think one of the best ways to have effective deterrence is to have an alliance, and the Biden-Harris administration has done a tremendous job building up our alliance with Japan, with South Korea, with Australia, with the other Indo-Pacific nations, and to me that's one of the best ways of pushing back against aggression. I was on a congressional delegation with Nancy Pelosi and Tim Walz, and we went to Tibet. And I can tell you, Tim Walz is he was an amazing member of Congress, he's an amazing governor, and he's one of the strongest supporters of democracy and of freedom. He is going to continue to carry on the strong policies of the Biden-Harris administration and to make sure we have strong alliances in the Indo-Pacific region to push back against any aggression. We do have a supply chain issue, and we're working rapidly in the United States to try to fix that, not only in the Department of Defense, but in a lot of other areas as well. Partly it was because of the pandemic, and partly it's because of all the different conflicts in the world, such as the Ukrainian conflict, that has caused a lot of supply issues, so we are rapidly trying to fix that.
Ambassador, you talked earlier about conflicting statements and actions from both Biden and Trump. Given, should Harris win, do you feel that this is an opportunity to reset China policy or Taiwan policy? And how would you see Indo-Pacific strategy look as a whole?
Well, I think if Kamala Harris is elected, I think you could expect to see a great similarity with what President Biden was doing in terms of policy towards Taiwan and toward China. So I think it'd be a little bit more of the same, whether you're for that or not. I think Biden has also emphasized, probably more than Donald Trump, alliance relationships. We know, of course, that my colleague will speak more about that, but the Europeans, for example, he's been increasingly critical of Europeans for not really pulling their own weight in the relationship. I don't know in terms of Kamala Harris how she would approach that. I think Kamala Harris, who's already visited the Philippines and Vietnam, Thailand, Japan, I think she would be probably more keen to try to strengthen those relationships. She has expressed concerns about the South China Sea conflict, and so I think that would probably be something in her favor. I don't know that President Trump recently has addressed those issues much at all.
In terms of Kamala Harris, she was also one of the main sponsors of the Hong Kong bill in support of Hong Kong democracy with Joshua. Do you feel she will continue with that work as president, or do you feel she'll walk more to the middle, as with some say that her 2019 campaign policies have shifted from the left to the center, which have disappointed some of her supporters?
Well, I think she probably will continue to head toward the center.
And this includes with human rights as well.
Including with human rights. I mean, it's, you know, one of the first, my experience when I worked for the US government was that human rights is often the first thing that goes out the door when you're dealing with other tough issues, geopolitical issues, geostrategic issues.
Marcin, turning to you, how do you compare the million-dollar question in the room, support for Taiwan versus support for Ukraine, as many analysts around the world have talked about how it's a zero-sum game, where if you support Ukraine, then Taiwan will not get the sufficient support, while many in Taiwan also say that both support is required, as we've seen from former President Tsai Ing-wen.
The zero-sum game mentality exhibited by some analysts who present the choice between supporting Ukraine and supporting Taiwan as a dichotomous one points to their myopia and lack of complete understanding of the growing confluence of strategic interests between Moscow and Beijing that we have observed at least since 2014, which is the year of the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. There's a growing body of evidence that China and Russia collaborate on coordinating their strategies of hybrid warfare and particularly political warfare. For example, we can point to parallels in strategies of lawfare deployed by both the Russian Federation against Ukraine as well as the People's Republic of China as a part of its so-called three warfares, Sanjan. And this, to me, indicates that we need to educate policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic about the need to harmonize security and defense policy that pertains to the Euro-Atlantic theater as well as the Indo-Pacific theater. We need an inter-theater outlook, and it is not a dichotomous choice to support either Ukraine or Taiwan. I mentioned that resources, no matter how abundant, at the end of the day have to be allocated in a way that will make them scarce in some contexts. At the end of the day, I do believe that active support for Ukraine, a conflict in which China has clearly taken a side despite its claims of neutrality and aspirations to serve as a neutral broker, is a way of supporting Taiwan as well.
Speaking of a strong supporter of both Ukraine and Taiwan, let's now hear from Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi, who spoke with the Taiwan delegation in Chicago. Pelosi has been a longtime supporter of Taiwan and a vocal supporter of Chinese democracy. She also visited the country, Taiwan, in 2022 to meet with then-President Tsai Ing-wen, despite strong opposition from China.
We have are trying to get a bilateral trade agreement with Taiwan. Japan has a bilateral agreement, even though it, as the United States, recognizes China. But nonetheless, they still have a bilateral, and we're striving to get that. In the meantime, we're being successful in moving toward a tax policy, which makes it easier for us in Taiwan and you and the United States.
ADTA.
Yeah, and that's really something that has developed over time. And so, I want that bilateral. And in the course of talking about it, to tell everyone, and I think Taiwan has been a purchaser of so much agriculture from the United States and different things that they may not be aware of. A small country, one of the leading purchasers of U.S. agriculture. And then, of course, there's the issue of the chips.
Apart from Nancy Pelosi's visit, from the Democratic side, what made headlines in Taiwan was the 6 assurances. It was first put into the party platform this year. What do you say to that?
Well, it's been a long time coming. I mean, after all, it's 1982 when the 6 assurances were given. Then it took a while before it was declassified. You know, if you look at the 6 assurances now, they're not all that impressive, really. So for it to go into the Democratic, Republican platforms is not indicative of a great deal of progress, in my view. Again, I would like to see more substantive progress on issues like weapons, actually sales being delivered. I'd like to see 2758, the UN resolution, addressed, whereby you know, the United States would come out more strongly in support of, you know, Taiwan is not a part of China. So I think it's clearly a step, I guess, forward, but it's a very minor step.
Marcin, you've seen Nancy Pelosi talk about the economic aspect. What do you feel would motivate the U.S. and other countries, as in your European Value Center role, you deal with a lot of the economic side, for countries such as the U.S. and Europe to support Taiwan or to increase their support?
I believe that it always takes two in any relation. So there are also things that Taiwan needs to fix before gaining more support. And speaking from a European perspective, the roadmap laid out by the European Commission is very clear. There are two main issues in the economic relation between Taiwan and the European Union that remain unresolved. One is the excessive local content requirement for offshore wind farms that precludes reasonably priced market access for European companies amid Taiwan's quest to buttress its renewable energy production capacity. And the second issue is related to agriculture. That is something that audiences in the United States will understand as well. Taiwanese agricultural trade policies tend to be very protectionist, often imposing highly differentiated tariffs on goods at different levels of processing. So in simpler terms, tariffs on importing raw grain are much lower than on importing flour, for example. So of course, Taiwan should get support as an active contributor to the democratic community, to the global democratic community, and that includes democratic economies. But Taipei needs to clean up its act as well.
Thank you very much for both of your insights. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching. Stay safe and see you next time.